Well, I have a feeling folks will start coming in while I also welcome everyone. So I'll maybe get started with my remarks, and then everyone will be showing up during those remarks, and hopefully we can have a nice full house when we hear Dr. McCormick speak. So welcome everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for attending. My name is Nicole Newman and I'm the director of Max Kade German American Research and Resource Center here at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, also known as IUPUI. Thank you for joining us today for a book talk with Dr. Richard Mccormick from the University of Minnesota. I would like to begin our event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather virtually is the occupied and contested territory of Native peoples. We thus wish to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples on whose ancestral homelands and resources Indiana University was built and currently occupies. I also wish to acknowledge that with its founding in 1969, IUPUI also displaced a vibrant Black community in Indianapolis. So before introducing our guest today, I want to take a moment to introduce the Max Kade Center to those of you who may not be familiar with our work. We connect to the community, we give out quite a few student scholarships, and then we also host 3 to 5 events per academic year. Of course, as you know, you are here because of COVID-19. We usually do things in person, but we are excited for the opportunities of connecting internationally and nationally online. So we hope next year to do a mix of events, and we would be very happy to have you attend those. I should also note that we have one final event on in May with Anja Petty, who is the Associate Director of the Max Kade Institute in Madison, Wisconsin at UW-Madison. She's going to be giving a talk that looks at attitudes towards pandemics and attitudes about health in the German American press. I will put a link to that event to RSVP in the chat. When I conclude, I'll also put a link to the Max Kade Center and to our Twitter page, which has perhaps the most up-to-date information about our goings on. I also just want to take a moment to clarify how this talk will work today. After I introduce him, Rick will speak for about an hour with excerpts from his book and some engagement with Lubitsch's film, To Be or Not to Be. If you're at IU, you can watch that film on Canopy if you haven't already. It's also available via the Criterion channel. You are very welcome to participate in the discussion. So we ask that during the talk, you put any questions or comments you might have into the chat. And then of course, during the Q&A, you're invited to pose your questions orally with your camera on or off or in the chat as well. We do ask that you keep your microphone off during the talk and also whenever you're not speaking. The event is going to be recorded, so you'll see that little light perhaps on your screen, and we'll post it to the Max Kade YouTube channel later today. So just a heads up that that's happening as well. So now to the main event. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to someone whom I have known for the last 20 years and who has been a constant sort of guiding guiding force in my academic life. And that is, of course, somebody who is also my Doktorvater, Dr. Richard Mccormick. Rick is a professor of German and has taught German film and media and culture at the University of Minnesota since 1987. He has an incredible body of scholarship, which includes the books Gender and Sexuality in Weimar Modernity, Film, Literature, and New Objectivity, and Politics of the Self, Feminism and the Postmodern in West German Literature and Film. He also has co-edited multiple volumes, which include Legacies of Modernism, Art and Politics in Northern Europe, 1890 to 1950, Gender and German Cinema, Feminist Interventions, and also German Essays on Film, which was co-edited with Alison Gunther-Pahl, who is supposed to be in attendance today. However, we are gathered today in order to hear about his latest book, which was published with Indiana University Press, and that's entitled, of course, as you can read here along with me, Sex, Politics, and Comedy, The Transnational Cinema of Ernst Lubitsch. Now, I suspect that this might be Rick's last event for the academic year, so I want to take one final moment to thank him for his ongoing mentorship and support, even with many miles between us. So, welcome, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for that kind and generous introduction. I'm happy to be here. I will just share my screen. I want to thank you, Nicole, also for the invitation to give this talk. And I also want to thank the Max Kade German American Center. I also want to wish all of you happy Earth Day. There is no, I was trying to think of a way to connect Lubitsch to Earth Day. Well, I would just say that his global and transnational perspective, the transnational perspective that he embodied as a person and as an artist who went from Germany to the United States, is the perspective, is the kind of global perspective we need for Earth Day and for any number of other of the issues that are plaguing us and this planet right now. What I'm going to do is read an excerpt from the introduction of my book and show some slides that I hope will illustrate what I'm reading. And then I'll read a shorter excerpt from the beginning of chapter 7, which is the chapter on Lubitsch's 1942 anti-Nazi comedy, To Be or Not to Be. And then at the very end, I'll show a clip, the opening scene of To Be or Not to Be, and then we'll have, I think, plenty of time for discussion. So the introduction to my book is titled Transnational Jewish Comedy, and it opens with a quote by Lubitsch from 1924, already 2 years into his life in America, where he, and of course he said, every good film is by nature international. 100 years ago, in 1920, a German film premiered in New York and became a surprise hit, Madame de Berry, directed in Berlin by Ernst Lubitsch. Within 2 years, Lubitsch was invited to Hollywood. Madame de Berry was not a comedy, but Lubitsch would make comedies in America. Of all the film directors who came to the United States from Germany in the first half of the 20th century, Lubitsch would be the most successful. Only Billy Wilder enjoyed comparable success, and he considered Lubitsch to be his mentor. Lubitsch's influence on American film comedy was unparalleled. Lubitsch's career was clearly transnational. Like the cinema itself, his films were shaped by movements of people, stories, artists, technicians, and technologies across national boundaries. His own perspective was determined by transnational experience. His father migrated from Russia to Berlin in the late 19th century, and Lubitsch himself migrated from Berlin to Hollywood in 1922. Because he was a transnational filmmaker, it's crucial to focus on his work, not his work on both sides of the Atlantic, his German career from 1913 to 22, and his American career from 1923 to 1947. But few books in English have done this. Joseph McBride's book from 2018, How Did Lubitsch Do It?, does provide some coverage of both Lubitsch's German and American films. Two of its 9 chapters focus on Lubitsch in Germany. In contrast, my book gives equal weight to his German and American careers with in-depth analysis of key feature films from the 1910s to the 1940s. Lubitsch's career is easily divided chronologically into its German and American periods, but it can be argued that he was making American-style films before he left Germany. Lubitsch had what is now called in Germany a migration background. And that background links him to an American sensibility. That is, an attitude more typical of America, a land so obviously shaped by immigration. Lubitsch's gender politics were always more emancipatory than what became conventional in Hollywood, or Germany for that matter. Indeed, his daughter Nicola Lubitsch, asserted recently that his films anticipated the Me Too movement. From 1914 until his death in 1947, Lubitsch's films, comedies or otherwise, lampooned sex, money, and power. Someone positioned as an outsider first in Germany and then in the United States, could be expected to have a special sensitivity to the way social hierarchies and social norms around sex and gender could exclude certain social groups. Lubitsch began his life as a member of the Jewish minority in Germany, a group whose rights were restricted in Wilhelmine Germany, that is the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was to some extent an outsider within the German community, the German Jewish community as well, because his father was an Ostjude, an Eastern European Jew. Lubitsch's migration background was a key factor in the success of the milieu comedies set in the Jewish garment industry in Berlin, with which his film career began. This background would also help him in Hollywood. Transnational patterns of migration helped shape Lubitsch's life and career and Hollywood as well. For example, the Jews fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe in the late 19th century headed west toward large cities like Berlin, Hamburg, New York, and Los Angeles. Ernst Lubitsch's father, Simon, arrived in Berlin around 1880. When Ernst arrived in Hollywood in 1922, he found a film industry run largely by men who, like his father Simon, had left Eastern Europe, or who, like Ernst himself, had fathers who had left Eastern Europe. Film scholar Miriam Hansen considered this connection to migration and to immigrants to be significant for the vernacular modernism of early American cinema. According to Hansen, early cinema was a vernacular rather than high modernism. It was dynamic, popular, and transnational. Silent cinema was itself transnational. Films could be exported easily and cheaply, simply by translating the text on the title cards. More substantively, silent films communicated primarily through images, especially of faces and gestures. Silent films were easy to export if they had a visual and gestural language that could be understood across national boundaries. Miriam Hansen's concept of vernacular modernism refers to this transnational address of the early cinema, above all the American cinema. She explains the tremendous international appeal of early American cinema in the 1910s as being partly due to its dynamic physicality, especially its physical comedy, and its address to a multicultural urban audience that included masses of working class immigrants who did not speak English well. Its transnational character was enhanced by the role played by immigrants, many of them Eastern European Jews, in building the American film industry. In many ways, the United States developed a cinema that was of, by, and for immigrants. Lubitsch's Lubitsch's German career began in 1913 with short farcical comedies in which he played a comical Jewish character type active in the milieu of Konfektion, that is the retail garment industry in Berlin. And these characters often had migrated from Germany's eastern provinces, now Poland. So Lubitsch's family's migration to Berlin from Russia and his father's success in Konfektion were key to the grasp of the world that Lubitsch portrayed in those early films. He played characters who strove aggressively for upward mobility in a parody of assimilation. And here you see a still from the earliest film in which Lubitsch appears that still exists. His fourth film, Der Stolz der Firma, The Pride of the Firm, from 1914. This was the first film in which he had a starring role. But already in that same year of 1914, he began to direct as well as star in these films. Schuh-Palace Pincus from 1916 is the earliest surviving example. And this is the last milieu film he made, Meyer from Berlin, which was made actually before the end of World War I in the summer of 1918, but it did not premiere till early 1919, after the war was over and Germany's Weimar Republic had begun its first democracy. But because of his success with his comedies, he began making more expensive comedies with larger casts, and he eased himself out of acting. These comedies starred Ossie Oswalda, who played a spoiled, rebellious bad girl. As Thomas Brondelmeyer observed, her character was an alter ego of the bad boys, the aggressive Jewish male protagonist Lubitsch himself had played. And this is one of my main arguments in the book, that the Jewish bad boy, Lubitsch, the Jewish rascal character that Lubitsch himself had played in the milieu comedies, becomes the bad girl in his later films. Here you see Ossie Oswalda in his first comedy after World War I, a very big budget for a comedy, The Oyster Princess, in which she plays a spoiled American bad girl. I'm going backwards, sorry. And here you see another comedy that with Ossie Oswalda from 1919, Die Puppe, the doll, in which she masquerades as a robot, subverting the male fantasy of the perfectly submissive female. But already in 1918, Lubitsch began to make expensive costume dramas, melodramas, with historical or exotic settings. Carmen in 1918 was made just before the end of World War I, and it premiered just after the war ended. And after the war, because of the success of Carmen, he was given a huge budget to make the historical costume film Madame du Barry in 1919. Sumaroon in 1920 and The Loves of the Pharaoh in 1922 were among the other high-budget exotic costume epics he directed in the early Weimar Republic. The costume epics also tended to focus on bad girl protagonists, although such heroines could triumph in the comedies. In the historical or exotic costume melodramas, they were punished, killed usually, because of the sexist conventions of the genre and the era. Here you see Paula Negri, who is the bad girl protagonist of Madame du Barry, who starts as a lowly seamstress and sleeps her way to the top of French society until she's the mistress of Louis XV. And then, of course, she must be punished, and she's punished no less than by the French Revolution at the guillotine at the end of the film. Lubitsch, however, let me just say that Paula Negri was also able to appear as the protagonist in Lubitsch's final German comedy, The Wildcat of 1921. And there, of course, in a comedy, she not only survived the end of the film, she got to triumph. Lubitsch was brought to Hollywood because of his interest. Lubitsch was brought to Hollywood because of interest in his costume epics, not because of his migration background or his comedies. The artistic quality and the commercial success of the epics caught Hollywood's attention. The American film industry was eager for the prestige associated with European culture. Companies were also looking for ways to increase their share of the European market. Warner Brothers was one of the studios one of the studios that hired Lubitsch when he got to America. And they were famous up until they hired Lubitsch for Rin Tin Tin, their films with this dog, Rin Tin Tin. So you can understand why they would want the prestige of a European director. The result, however, was a delicious irony. The film industry in Hollywood was run largely by Eastern European Jews who had built fortunes with films that appealed to the immigrant, working class, Jewish and Catholic audiences of the big cities, but now they wanted to make prestige films that would be accepted by mainstream middle-class Protestant audiences. The industry leaders thought that European artistry would give them prestige, and so they hired Lubitsch, who had the same Eastern European background that they did. After World War I, Hollywood emerged as the most powerful film industry in the world. In the 1920s, one of its main competitors would be the German film industry, which became known for its artistic quality and its technical expertise. Hollywood became aware of the competitive threat from Germany when it discovered Lubitsch. His historical costume epic, Madame du Barry, earned a lot of money in New York after it premiered there in 1920, opening up the US market again to German films for the first time since World War I. It was also the first foreign film to become a hit in the United States, and it initiated the post-war wave of historical costume films. Hollywood initially responded by trying to produce Lubitsch's films in Germany. The 1920s would become a very transnational decade for the cinema, with many co-productions involving German and American film companies. Such collaboration began with Ernst Lubitsch. After the success of Madame du Barry in the United States in late 1920, interest in Lubitsch led to the founding of the European Film Alliance, or EFA, EFA, in 1921. This European film production company was financed by American money, by Adolf Sukor's famous Players Lasky, which was the parent company of Paramount. EFA hired Lubitsch and his producer, Paul Davidson, away from UFA, Germany's largest studio. Thus it happened that Lubitsch's last two German films, Loves of the Pharaoh in 1922 and Die Flamme, or as it was called in the United States, Montmartre in 1923, these last two German films were financed by American money and filmed with American equipment and to some extent with American technical personnel. The casts of the films were largely European, were entirely European. Loves of the Pharaoh employed thousands of cheap German extras. But the EFA model of an American finance production company in Europe failed. It was easier to invite Lubitsch to Hollywood, and he arrived there in December 1922. Lubitsch was the first of many German film artists to make that journey in the 1920s. Among those who came after him were Friedrich Murnau, Erich Pommer, Emil Jannings, Konrad Veidt, Wilhelm Dieterle, and Marlene Dietrich. Lubitsch himself would bring many German film artists to Hollywood over the course of the 1920s. Screenwriter Hans Kraly, assistant editor Heinz, later Henry, Blanke, and designer Hans Dreyer. Blanke came on the ship with Lubitsch and his wife in December 1922. Lubitsch sent for Kraly already in the summer of 1923, and then for Dreyer in 1924. He sent for costume designer Ali Hubert to join him in Hollywood in late 1926. Although Hollywood was interested in Lubitsch for the blockbuster epic costume dramas or spectacles he had made in Germany, he did not end up making that kind of film in Hollywood. Instead, he returned to his cinematic roots, comedy. His American comedies, however, would not be like his German comedies, which had been wild, anarchic, grotesque farces with lots of slapstick and broad humor. He was hired to bring European prestige to American cinema, and he did so by performing European sophistication. He made a number of what were called sophisticated comedies focused on adultery. His comedies in this style were suggestive but safely set in an imaginary Vienna or Paris. Their discreet style, eventually called the Lubitsch touch, made them acceptable to American audiences. His first such sophisticated comedy was The Marriage Circle in 1924, followed by the other silent films he made at Warner Brothers in the mid-1920s. These films were very free adaptations of European plays and operettas, and he made them with help from German film artists and technicians. Meanwhile, He published in the trade journals of the German film industry, and he followed the German cinema in terms of technical developments, especially as pioneered by Murnau, Karl Freund, and Ewald André Dupont. This influence is clearly visible in the cinematography and montage of his last film for Warner, So This Is Paris, in 1926. At the same time, he paid attention to the popular genres being produced in Germany. He directed a silent operetta for MGM, The Student Prince in Old Heidelberg in 1927, starring Mexican actor Ramon Novarro and Norma Shearer. And he even made a Berg film, a mountain film, for United Artists, Eternal Love in 1929, which was his final silent film. Lubitsch managed the transition to sound with no problem. Instead of following what became the dominant American model for a film musical, which justified singing in a naturalistic way by telling a story about performers, the so-called backstage musical, Lubitsch used the more fantastic model of the European operetta, in which characters sing their emotions as opposed to speaking about them. And that is what would later be called an integrated musical. He made a string of such musicals starting in 1929 with The Love Parade, which starred Maurice Chevalier and Jeanette MacDonald, as so many of his musicals would. In the early 1930s, however, he also made two very important sophisticated comedies that were not musicals. Trouble in Paradise in 1932, about two jewel thieves, Miriam Hopkins and Herbert Marshall, who try to swindle a rich Parisian widow, Kay Francis, and that creates the romantic triangle that is so typical of many of Lubitsch's comedies. And then even more risque was Design for Living in 1933, which I have called, which I labeled the polygamous touch because it's about a menage a trois. Here you see Miriam Hopkins as probably Lubitsch's most untamable bad girl with her harem, Frederick March and Gary Cooper. However, beginning with the strict imposition of the production code in Hollywood in 1934 and the rise of much more populist films, above all the screwball comedy in New Deal America, Lubitsch's model of sophisticated comedy set among the European elite fell out of favor. And this determined his later American period in which Lubitsch adjusted to these developments. He tried to address the common people more, and he became more overtly political, but no less focused on Europe. After 1933, when Hitler came to power, Lubitsch helped find work in Hollywood for the second wave of emigres, Jewish film artists fleeing Nazi Germany and those other countries endangered and later annexed or conquered by that regime. As the 1930s progressed, Lubitsch was ever more concerned about the real Europe and its politics, as opposed to the imaginary Europe he had created for Americans in his sophisticated comedies and musicals of the mid-1920s and early 1930s. The Nazi threat and then the start of World War II in Europe influenced his work, as can be seen in Ninotchka in 1939, The Shop Around the, and there you see Ninotchka with a number of emigres in the cast, not just Greta Garbo from Sweden, but Felix Bressart, Sig Rumen, and Alexander Granach, three German Jewish refugees. The Shop Around the Corner, 1940. Here you see a still of Felix Bressart again and Jimmy Stewart. And then finally, the anti-Nazi comedy of 1942, To Be or Not to Be. So throughout his career, from the rise of a Jewish anti-hero in Berlin's retail trade in Shoe Palace Pincus in 1916, to a queer story about a girl dressing as a man to overcome gender barriers in Imperial Germany in Ich möchte kein Mann sein, or I Don't Want to Be a Man from 1918, which came out before the end of the World War I, all the way to 1942 with the second-rate Polish actors, among them an explicitly Jewish character who outwit the Nazis in To Be or Not to Be. Through this whole period, the entire career, Lubitsch's comedies made fun of the powerful, attacked bullies, and betrayed a sympathy with the underdog and with outsiders, with Jews, with women, and with other rebellious types. Sex also deconstructs power in his films. Sexual desire can make powerful characters look ridiculous, and this too is political. Lubitsch's films must be contextualized in terms of larger historical developments, such as the end of the German Empire with defeat in World War I and the beginning of Germany's first democracy, the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933, with its rising anti-Semitism, but also its groundbreaking tolerance for sexual minorities, the racism and xenophobia of America's roaring 20s, and then the upheaval of the Great Depression, the phenomenon of the emancipated new woman in both Germany and the United States, and the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the World War that they started. His films also need to be analyzed as examples of the art of film. Above all, the mode of comedy was crucial to his work. His career began with comedy in Berlin, and his greatest successes in Hollywood were comedies. They involved a large range of styles, from slapstick anarchic to sophisticated comedy, and from romantic comedy to what I call anti-fascist screwball. The humor of even his most escapist comedies was always focused on sex, power, and money, and thus a keen understanding of social expectations and barriers based on class, ethnicity, and gender is always present beneath the humor. In fact, the humor depended on those social norms, which were ridiculed. This attention to social norms brings us back to transnational politics. An understanding of Lubitsch's films demands attention to the specific politics in both Germany and the United States in the early 20th century. Okay, so that is the excerpt from the introduction of my book that I'm reading to you, and now I'm going to read you a shorter excerpt from the beginning of chapter 7, which I call Coming Out as Jewish, To Be or Not to Be, 1942. And here, this is the ultimate example of what I call screwball anti-fascism. Joseph McBride sees Trouble in Paradise as the pinnacle of Lubitsch's career. For him, the sophisticated Lubitsch is the essential one. But I prefer the more outrageous and political Lubitsch, whose work leads to Be or Not to Be, a film that is not at all sophisticated, but rather a much broader, more farcical and darker comedy. With this anti-Nazi comedy, Lubitsch's screwball experiments of the late 1930s and early 1940s culminated in this new fusion that I call screwball anti-fascism. Part marital comedy, part suspenseful wartime melodrama, screwball and noir at the same time. It was a generic hybrid, more controversial with the critics than anything that Lubitsch had tried before. Many thought it was in aesthetic and political bad taste. But it gave expression to Lubitsch's own political concerns and anxieties as Nazi Germany conquered ever more of Europe. It was also a film in which the situation of the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe and in Hollywood as well would be central to the film's politics. To Be or Not to Be was Lubitsch's most personal and most political film. It was not an adaptation of an already existing play or operetta, as almost every other Lubitsch film had been. Rather, it was an original story based on an idea by Lubitsch. Melchior Lengyel helped him write it, and then he helped him write up the treatment, and then Edwin Justice Mayer was hired to write the screenplay. When filming began in November 1941, before Pearl Harbor, it was still not easy to make an anti-Nazi film in Hollywood, especially one that addressed the specific threat that Nazism posed to the Jews. Chaplin's The Great Dictator from 1940 was an obvious exception, and it clearly influenced Lubitsch. By the time To Be or Not to Be premiered, however, in March 1942, America was at war, and it had become patriotic and good business to make anti-Nazi films. But even then, films that thematized the plight of the Jews would be rare. This film is, in fact, the only film from Lubitsch's American career to contain an explicitly Jewish character, Greenberg. While the word Jew is never uttered in the film, that too is telling for a film that Joel Rosenberg praised for its bold and profound use of a Jewish character as a pivotal figure in the story. While the film was moderately successful at the box office, it was controversial with some important critics. This was not because of its depiction of a Jewish character, but rather because it was a comedy, indeed a darker comedy than Chaplin's film, which operated in a purely comic universe in which stormtroopers can be repelled by a few well-aimed whacks of a frying pan. Many critics did like Lubitsch's film. Outside New York, a majority of the reviews were positive, but some influential critics did not. In two articles in the New York Times, dated March 7th and March 22nd, 1942, Bosley Crowther wrote that the film was in bad taste, both for mixing genres, farcical comedy and wartime melodrama, and for being a comedy about the Nazi invasion of Poland. The brilliantly reflexive opening of Lubitsch's film anticipated this very controversy that would plague the film by staging a debate about the appropriateness of comedy for anti-fascist art as opposed to realistic documentary. The opening scene also called into question the very appearance of reality with its emphasis on acting and simulation, a key preoccupation of the entire film. In some ways, the critical devaluation of Lubitsch's comedy still exists today. Mladen Dolar wrote that this is because of the general deprecation of comedy. He calls To Be or Not to Be one of the greatest movies ever made, precisely because it is a comedy, all the more so because Lubitsch made it at the moment of the great triumph of fascism. The film is in production in January 1942, which, unbeknownst to Americans, is the very time when the Wannsee Conference is happening in Berlin, and the final solution about the attempted genocide of all European Jews is being codified among the high Nazi elite at that conference. Dolar insists, comedy is the best answer to the hour of greatest despair. And I agree. Lubitsch's comedy is the best anti-Nazi film of the 1940s. In addition to the film's brilliant opening, which I'm about to show you, the entire film works to deconstruct with humor the cult of power that Nazism embodies. Excuse me, that's my dog. It's not the Nazis, it's the mailman that my dog is getting upset about. Excuse me for that. Okay, I think she's calmed down. I'm sorry again. Okay, so in addition to the film's brilliant opening, the entire film works to deconstruct with humor the cult of power that Nazism embodies, revealing it to be a movement of insecure bullies, sycophants, and hypocritical functionaries who simulate fanatical loyalty, are insecure in their performances of that loyalty, and are blind in the most banal and bureaucratic way to the evil that they facilitate. A key aspect of the film is the way in which, both as a production and as a cinematic text, it addressed the concern of Jewish artists, anti-Semitism, and the strategic question of how openly Jewish identity should be acknowledged. Such concerns were particularly vexing in Hollywood during the 1930s. To keep the German market in Europe after 1933, most studios tried to de-emphasize overtly Jewish characters and stories. In fact, even during World War II, American anti-Nazi films rarely made overt references to the plight of the Jews, as the studios tried both to align with Allied policy and not to attract the attention of American anti-Semitism out in the country and in the State Department as well. German Jews had experienced similar concern during the Weimar Republic and earlier. How out should one be about one's identity as a Jew in Germany, even in its new democratic republic? As Carrie Wallach has demonstrated, this question was very complicated. To whom was it safe to reveal one's Jewish identity? To what extent did one even have control about whether or not one was recognized as Jewish? Besides the controversy around comedy that the film engendered and thematized, and besides the issue of anti-Semitism in Europe, but also in America, one cannot ignore the film's gender politics. In addition to being a political farce that deconstructs Nazism, it is also a marital comedy featuring yet another triangle with a woman at the apex, Maria Tura, played by Carol Lombard, the exemplary screwball heroine of the 1930s who got top billing for this film. She plays a Polish actor married to the male protagonist, the vain Polish actor Joseph Tura, played by Jack Benny. And the other leg of the triangle is Lieutenant Sobinski, a young Polish pilot played by Robert Stack. Maria is another one of Lubitsch's untamable bad girls, a married woman who is willing to stick out her neck for the good fight against the Nazis, but who is not willing to give up her interest in other men. Okay, and I will stop my share for a moment now, because now I'm going to show you a clip from the beginning of To Be or Not to Be. After talking so long, I think we'll let Lubitsch have the last word, and we'll show the very beginning of To Be or Not to Be. So that's the opening of the film. I'm sorry that we don't have as much time for discussion as I thought we would have, but it gives you an idea of what I think is Lubitsch's best film. But to the extent there's time, I'm willing to answer some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. I will gladly welcome any questions in the chat. If you want to speak, you can also let me know in there that you're willing to voice your questions. Feel free to turn your cameras on, leave them off, whatever you want to do. But yeah, let's open up the floor for any questions you might have about Lubitsch, about his life, about excuse me, about To Be or Not to Be, the broader film for those of you who have watched it, or also just this opening sequence that we saw from Rick. Is there anyone that would like to start? Otherwise, I can get things off with a question, Rick. You know, I was curious. You said that you interpreted the bad girls of his German comedies as sort of alter egos or sort of projections of himself, and I was curious why you think then that there was a gender change, or how that fits into your reading of Lubitsch as those bad girls.
Well, I don't know if I can answer why. I just think it's an interesting phenomenon to think of it as this kind of interesting kind of cross-gender identification that Lubitsch seems to do. I mean, he was known for his ability to work well with women actors. He was known for the assertiveness of the women characters in his films, certainly in terms of sex, if not always in terms of work. I just think it's interesting that early on, you do see the same types of characters, the same kind of brash protagonists sort of switching gender. It's just an interesting thing. And then it makes me pay attention to all his bad girls from there on. And even in the films that are much less emancipatory, if you pay attention to the bad girls, you usually can find something interesting going on.
Thank you. We have a comment from Vanna in the chat. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Do you have any reports about German exile actors from the film To Be or Not to Be playing in the film or even depicting Nazis?
Well, yes, Sig Ruman plays Colonel Erhard, who's the head of the Gestapo in Poland. And Sig Ruman and Felix Bressart plays Greenberg, that character, the Jewish character who we see in that opening scene where he says he can smell Hitler in Bronsky's portrayal of Hitler, and he wouldn't eat, and he accuses one of the actors of being a ham by saying, "What you are, I wouldn't eat," which is so. And then so Greenberg actually gets to play a Jewish character. Most of the German actors, German Jewish actors in the film, or Austrian Jewish actors in the film, tended to play Nazis. Like most Hollywood films of the era, if the Poles were the people that American audiences were supposed to identify with, then the Poles would speak like Americans and everyone else would have accents. Now, what's interesting is that he others Felix Bressart a little bit by allowing an accent. And of course, the way he treats this one explicitly Jewish character is very important because Greenberg is ultimately the hero of the film.
I think that's a good segue then, thank you, Vanna, to Kevin Sandler's question. Can you provide your opinion of why Greenberg did not appear in the last scene of To Be or Not to Be? What do you think happened to him?
Well, it's not clear. It's not clear. You see him last after he confronts the Nazis and gives his third rendition of the monologue from The Merchant of Venice, the Rialto monologue, and adds the word revenge. It's the most resistant performance of that monologue. And then he's taken away, but he's taken away by fake Nazis, and then we don't see him anymore in the film. There is a dialogue between Jack Benny, Joseph Tura, and Bronsky, the one who plays Hitler, in a car as they're speeding to the airport to escape to England. They say that Greenberg will be able to play Shylock again on the stage of the Warsaw, the Polski Theater. But he doesn't, obviously he's not in the plane with them. He doesn't go to England. He doesn't flee to England with them. He just disappears. And so of course it's significant that you could easily read it, and it has been read as a sort of symbolizing the sacrifice of the Jewish character who sacrifices himself so that everyone else can be saved. I mean, it's not clear cuts, but it has been read that way.
Thank you, Kevin. Vanna had a follow-up. Do we know anything about their reaction or response to paying Nazis? I'm not sure if it's paying or playing Nazis. It might be playing Nazis.
Well, obviously, you know, it wasn't just in this film. All the anti-Nazi films were filled with German and Austrian Jewish actors who had to play Nazis in the films. And of course, that was, on the one hand, distasteful personally, but on the other hand, it gave them work. A lot of actors, a lot of those exile actors only got work during during the war, and once the war was over, their careers were over, and a lot of them went back to Europe. So it's just one of the, it's just a tragic paradox of the situation.
Thank you. From Rick Herbert, do you know anything about his personal family life? That is, was his wife an independent woman, not limited to the roles permitted for women at that time?
Well, he had two wives, he had two unhappy marriages. His first wife cheated on him with one of his longest collaborators, Hans Kraly, who'd been writing, this was in 1930. He'd been writing films for Lubitsch since 1915. It's argued that the portrayal of marriage becomes much more cynical after that happens to Lubitsch. I don't know if that's entirely true, but you could make that argument. And his second wife, well, no, they weren't. Well, his second wife had worked in Hollywood, but didn't work during their marriage, and divorced him rather quickly. But they did have a child together. That Nicola is the child of the second marriage. No, they weren't. I mean, they weren't particularly emancipated relationships, although, as I said, his first wife did cheat on him, and apparently not just with that one guy. But then, of course, I don't believe he was a paragon of monogamous fidelity either.
I just want to take a moment to let everyone know I put two links into the chat. One is a link to the IU Press information about Rick's book, and the other is linked to his book through the University of Minnesota's Conservancy website. So back to the questions. We have one from Dennis Bingham. Hello, Dennis. Thank you for a wonderful talk. To what extent was the reception of To Be or Not to Be altered by the death of Carole Lombard in a plane crash shortly before the film opened?
Yes, I think, well, yeah, the plane crash was in January 1942, and that certainly delayed the release of the film. For the reason it didn't get released till March, I think was because of, although I don't have this in black and white, I never found it in black and white, but my impression is that the death of Carole Lombard delayed the release of the film. When the film came out, everyone loved her performance in it, but it could conceivably have depressed box office. Although even the critics, even a lot of the critics who didn't like the film loved the performance of Carole Lombard in the film. It was very sad. She was on a USO tour, and the plane crashed. They were heading to in the mountains of Nevada on the way to Los Angeles.
Thank you. We have a question from Siddhartha. Can you comment on why some German directors went back to Europe, like Douglas Sirk, after the war, and on the tragic aspect of their lives, loss of country, loss of vocation, etc.?
Well, Douglas Sirk didn't go back after the war. He had and as a matter of fact, the main success of Douglas Sirk's career was in the 1950s, making those big Technicolor melodramas. But then when he lost his sight by the end of the 1950s, or I don't know, no, it was Fritz Lang who lost his sight. It was, but Sirk was ill, however, after Imitation of Life, and then he retired to Switzerland. There were people who went back sooner, and one of the most tragic examples would have been Peter Laurie, who went back and in the early 1950s and tried to make an anti-Nazi film, and it bombed. The West German audiences didn't want to see an anti-Nazi film in 1951, and so he returned to America and returned to his heroin habit, and and increasingly was relegated to B roles, and his was a very tragic end. I mean, a lot of the exile people, a lot of the exile actors went back and weren't very well received in Germany. That was probably the most awful thing about that. And the most successful one, a lot of the ones who had been most successful in America stayed, like Billy Wilder, didn't go back. He went back to do some things, but he didn't go back to stay. Lubitsch, we don't know. I mean, Lubitsch died in 1947. Lubitsch might have gotten in trouble during the Red Scare because of his activities in the 1930s. It's not clear. The Red Scare had only started. The blacklist had only started in 1947 at the time when Lubitsch died. Edward Justice Mayer, however, who wrote the screenplay for To Be or Not to Be, was hooked up. He was a member of the Hollywood anti-Nazi League, and he was also had trouble during the blacklist era.
I just want to continue to invite everyone to either let me know in the chat if they have any questions or comments for Rick, or to put their questions or comments directly into the chat. While we just give folks another minute or two to sort of gather any thoughts or comments they might still have. Rick, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit too about maybe the ascribing of the Shylock character to Bressart's character in To Be or Not to Be, and you know, sort of how you interpret that, especially with the trajectory of Shylock within Merchant of Venice.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that Bressart does 3 times he recites lines from the Rialto monologue that Shylock has in The Merchant of Venice. And it's only the last time when he lunges at Hitler, of course it's a fake Hitler he's lunging at, and says, "Will we not revenge?" That line has not been used up to that point. You know, it's interesting that particular monologue is the monologue that Lubitsch used at 19 to get into Max Reinhardt's Deutsches Theater, which was one of the premier theaters of Berlin, and this was about 1911. So of course and in fact, a lot of people say that Lubitsch must have identified with Bressart because Bressart played a spear carrier in this Shakespeare play, and that's the main thing Lubitsch got to do at Max Reinhardt, is play spear carriers. I mean, he didn't have big parts. That's part of the reason why he went into film, because he wasn't getting big parts, and also he wanted to make some money.
Thank you. And for those who maybe aren't super familiar with Lubitsch's filmography, you spoke a little bit at the beginning about characterizing his German versus his American films, but I wonder if you could just maybe tease that out a little bit for those who might be neophytes when it comes to Lubitsch's cinema.
Well, I mean, the big difference is, with the comedies, that the comedies are much more anarchic and slapstick and farcical. Whereas in America, his comedies were famous for being sophisticated, although I would say that To Be or Not to Be is a departure and a move back in the direction of his earlier comedies, much more farcical, much broader humor, but also much darker. It's much darker than anything he did in Germany. And then, of course, you know, he became famous, internationally famous, because of those big costume melodramas that he did. And that's why Hollywood wanted him to come. And when he got here, there's only one film he made that falls into that category. He really did disappoint Hollywood, because he ended up making comedies and operettas, and he didn't make blockbusters. He made already in 1926, an American critic says, well, you know, why is he making comedies for secretaries? And he sort of genderized it. He said, why is he making these trivial comedies for women as opposed to making, you know, big historical epics like a male film director should. And I don't really know why, but he didn't. In America, he hardly ever made a film like that. Even the biggest productions he made were musicals.
We have another.
Not especially a masculine genre.
Oh, come on now. We have another question from Rick. What was one film that satisfied then Hollywood's demand?
Oh, the film he made that does fit most, that is most like the historical epics they expected him to make was the first film he made at Paramount in 1928, The Patriot with Emil Jannings. And that was about a mad Russian czar. So that, but that film unfortunately is lost. All we have is the trailer for it. It was a big success, but so were a lot of his films, and most of his films in the 1920s made money. And his films made money pretty much up to 1932, and then this kind of populist shift in American cinema and the Hollywood Production Code, the strictness of the Hollywood Production Code, made him lose a lot of money in the mid 1930s, and then he only came back in the late 30s with Ninochka.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Dennis. He asks, were there financial reasons for his not making historical blockbusters in the United States? Were those already considered the purview of DeMille, Stroheim, Griffith, although he was in decline in the 1920s?
Well, no, I mean, Lubitsch, they wanted to make him, he complained that Warner Brothers never offered him enough money and offered him the budget to make one of those films. But I think that may have been an excuse. I think after, I don't know if anyone's ever seen Loves of the Pharaoh, Das Weib, das Pharao, massive, ridiculous, racist, it's a terrible film. And apparently Henry Blanca said that Lubitsch was really tired of making those blockbusters. He was like, how many more thousands of people could he direct? He was really interested in smaller films like comedies, really like chamber plays almost. So he, but there were, I mean, The Patriot had a big budget. And as a matter of fact, by the early 1930s, when all the studios were in trouble because of the Depression, when Joseph von Sternberg directed the Scarlet Empress with Marlene Dietrich, he didn't even have the money to put together some of the production scenes of hordes of army horsemen storming the Kremlin. He used footage, and I'm sure Lubitsch let him do this. He used footage from Lubitsch's Patriot of 1928.
Great. Well, I'll just put the links I mentioned before to the Max Kata stuff, also our next event, but also again, I've compressed then all the links to Rick's book at IU Press, and then the copy that you can read through the University of Minnesota. So I just want to take a moment again to thank Rick for coming virtually to Indianapolis. It's been such a pleasure to host you. Please, either unmute or make your camera visible so we can say goodbye and thank you to Rick. It's been so lovely to see you.